The unraveling. The soft glow of the early morning sun streamed through the windows of Lincoln High School, casting a golden hue on the otherwise sterile hallways. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, blending with the distant chatter of students filtering in. Miss Evelyn Harper, the school's senior English teacher, adjusted her glasses as she sifted through a pile of neatly stacked lesson plans on her desk. Her classroom was immaculate, books aligned perfectly on shelves, desks arranged in precise rows, and the faint aroma of lavender wafting from a diffuser in the corner. Everything reflected the rigid structure she thrived on. She prided herself on discipline and order. Over her 2-decade career, she had cultivated a reputation for being stern yet effective. Her students either admired or feared her. There was no middle ground. Today, Evelyn was particularly irritable. She hadn't slept well. A nagging headache throbbed at her temples, and a faint unease tugged at the edges of her thoughts. The first period bell rang sharply, jolting her out of her reverie. Students shuffled into the room, their conversations cutting off as they took their seats under Evelyn's sharp gaze. Among them was a boy who stood out, not for his disobedience, but for his quiet defiance. Marcus Taylor, a wiry teenager with deep brown eyes that seemed far older than his years, slid into the desk furthest from the front. His body language was relaxed, his movements deliberate. A single notebook rested on his desk, its pages blank except for a doodle on the cover. Evelyn's eyes lingered on him for a moment before beginning her lecture. Today, we'll be exploring the themes of justice and morality in literature, Evelyn announced, her tone clipped as she wrote the day's objectives on the board. Her strokes were methodical, precise. As she began to explain the lesson, a faint tapping sound interrupted her flow. Tap, tap, tap. It was subtle, but in the quiet classroom, it grated like nails on a chalkboard. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. Marcus sat in the back, spinning his pen between his fingers in a rhythmic motion. His eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of amusement crossing his face before he looked away. "Mr. Taylor," Evelyn said, her voice icy, "is there something you'd like to share with the class?" "No, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. "Then kindly stop disrupting the lesson," she snapped. Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender, the pen still balanced between his fingers. "Yes, Mom." The class chuckled nervously. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She continued her lecture, but her focus wavered as the faint tapping resumed, softer this time, but no less irritating. The tension in the room grew palpable as students exchanged uneasy glances. Evelyn ignored it as long as she could, but the sound drilled into her consciousness. Finally, her patience snapped. "Marcus, come here," she barked, her voice cutting through the classroom like a whip. The room fell silent. Marcus rose slowly, his movements deliberate as he walked to the front of the class. He stood before her, his posture relaxed, his face expressionless. The difference in their statures was stark. Evelyn, with her rigid frame and sharp features, towered over Marcus, who slouched slightly, his head tilted as if in quiet defiance. "Give me the pen," Evelyn demanded, holding out her hand. Marcus hesitated, then placed the pen in her palm with exaggerated care. Her fingers closed around it tightly. "Return to your seat," she ordered. As Marcus turned to leave, she added sharply, "And I expect an essay from you on respect and classroom etiquette. Due tomorrow." Marcus paused, then glanced back at her over his shoulder. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly, his tone unreadable. He returned to his desk, his classmates watching him with wide eyes. Evelyn placed the pen on her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breathing. She resumed the lesson, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Whispers and exchanged glances punctuated her words. Marcus sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the blank page of his notebook, his expression unreadable. When the bell rang, students filed out quickly, eager to escape the charged atmosphere. Marcus lingered, his movements unhurried. As he passed Evelyn's desk, he paused. "You know," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Respect goes both ways." Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. But before she could respond, Marcus walked out, leaving her sitting at her desk, her hands clenched into fists. Evelyn spent the rest of the day distracted. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, intertwining with the faint but persistent headache that refused to subside. By the time the final bell rang, she was exhausted, her carefully maintained composure fraying at the edges. As she packed up her things, she noticed Marcus's pen still sitting on her desk. She picked it up, twirling it between her fingers as she pondered the day's events. Something about Marcus unnerved her, not his behavior, but the calm, measured way he carried himself. It was as if he knew something she didn't. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She looked up to see Principal William Taylor, Marcus's father, standing in the doorway. A tall man with a commanding presence, he rarely visited classrooms unannounced. "Miss Harper," he said, his deep voice tinged with politeness. "May I have a word?" Evelyn's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "Of course, Principal Taylor." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a weight that made Evelyn's chest tighten. "I understand there was an incident in your class today," he began, his tone even. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the sudden tension in the room. "Marcus was being disruptive, and I addressed it." Principal Taylor nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Marcus is a bright student," he said after a moment, "but he can be challenging." Evelyn resisted the urge to scoff. Challenging was an understatement. Principal Taylor continued, his tone growing more serious. "I'd like to remind you, Miss Harper, that every student here deserves respect, regardless of their behavior." Evelyn bristled at the implication. "I treat all my students fairly," she said, her tone clipped. Principal Taylor held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good," he said simply, "because respect goes both ways." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as Principal Taylor turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the pen still clutched in her hand. Something about his tone, his choice of words, made her heart pound. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a warning. The fault lines beneath. Evelyn Harper spent the evening pacing her living room, her thoughts consumed by the events of the day. Principal Taylor's words echoed in her mind, intertwining with Marcus's parting remark. Respect goes both ways. It wasn't just a comment, it felt like a direct challenge. The tightness in her chest refused to subside, and her usual evening routine of grading papers and organizing lesson plans offered no comfort. The house, usually her sanctuary, felt oppressive. The dim light of the table lamp cast long shadows across her neatly arranged bookshelves and framed certificates. On the desk, Marcus's pen lay where she'd placed it, an innocuous object that now seemed to radiate unease. Evelyn tried to push the tension aside, rationalizing that she'd handled the situation appropriately. Marcus was disrespectful, and I had to assert my authority. That's all there is to it, she told herself, but the thought felt hollow. Unable to focus, she opened her laptop and pulled up Marcus's student file. As she scrolled through his academic records, a faint picture began to emerge. His grades were inconsistent, stellar in some subjects, mediocre in others. Teachers' comments ranged from praise for his intellect to notes about his tendency to challenge authority. But one detail stood out. His mother's absence was noted in the file. A brief mention that she had passed away when Marcus was younger. Evelyn frowned, her curiosity piqued. Was that why he acted out? A need to push boundaries. She shut the laptop abruptly. Digging into Marcus's personal life felt invasive, even if her curiosity gnawed at her. Instead, she resolved to address the matter directly the following day. Set boundaries, reassert control, and move on. It was a simple plan, one that had worked countless times before. But this time, something about Marcus felt different. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at school earlier than usual. She needed the quiet to collect herself before facing the students. The halls were empty, save for the faint echo of footsteps from the janitorial staff. As she unlocked her classroom door, she noticed a folded piece of paper slipped under the frame. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked it up. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous. "Everyone has a breaking point. Yours is showing." Her breath caught as she read the note again. A chill ran down her spine. She glanced down the hallway, but it was empty. The school's usual morning bustle hadn't yet begun. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the paper as her mind raced. Who wrote this? Marcus. One of his friends. She crumpled the note and shoved it into her bag, refusing to let it rattle her. If this is a prank, I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me shaken. Still, as she set up for her lesson, her movements were jittery, her thoughts disjointed. By the time first period began, the classroom was alive with the usual hum of students settling in. Marcus entered last, his walk slow and deliberate, as if he were in no rush to join the rest of the world. He took his seat in the back row, his expression calm, almost detached. Evelyn forced herself to ignore him as she started the lesson. "Today, we'll continue our discussion on justice and morality," she announced, her voice sharper than usual. "Open your textbooks to page 74. As the class worked through the assigned passage, Evelyn's attention kept drifting toward Marcus. He was scribbling something in his notebook, not notes on the lesson, but a pattern of shapes and lines. Doodles. She clenched her jaw, the sound of his pencil scratching against the paper grating on her nerves. "Marcus," she said suddenly, her tone cutting, "care to share what's so fascinating in your notebook?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, who looked up with an unhurried calm. "Just drawing," he replied evenly, closing the notebook with deliberate slowness. "This isn't art class," Evelyn snapped. "Pay attention." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice dripping with mock obedience. A few students stifled laughter, but Evelyn's gaze remained locked on Marcus. She could feel her control slipping, her carefully maintained authority fraying at the edges. The boy's calm demeanor was more infuriating than open defiance. It was as though he knew exactly how far he could push without crossing a line. After class, Evelyn watched Marcus linger at his desk while the other students filed out. He seemed in no hurry to leave, and when the room was empty, he approached her desk. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice soft but steady, "are you okay?" The question caught her off guard. "Excuse me?" "You seem tense," Marcus said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "I just thought I'd ask." Evelyn stared at him, unsure whether to interpret the comment as genuine concern or a subtle jab. "I'm fine, Marcus," she said stiffly. "But if you focused as much on your studies as you do on observing me, perhaps your grades would reflect it." Marcus's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Fair enough," he said, turning to leave. But as he reached the door, he glanced back. "Oh, and about respect. It's not something you can force, Miss Harper. It has to be earned." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Evelyn standing at her desk, her fists clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. Evelyn's day spiraled from there. The faculty lounge buzzed with gossip, the whispers subsiding whenever she entered the room. By lunchtime, her headache had returned with a vengeance. She caught Principal Taylor in the hallway and briefly considered discussing the note she had found. But something stopped her. Instead, she focused on his demeanor, trying to discern whether he suspected anything about her growing conflict with Marcus. "Miss Harper," he said as they crossed paths, his tone polite but cool. "I trust today is going smoother than yesterday." "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. "Thank you for checking in." Principal Taylor nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made Evelyn's stomach twist. He knew more than he was letting on. That evening, Evelyn found another note waiting for her when she returned to her classroom to collect her things. This one was taped to her desk. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded it. Sometimes control is an illusion. Let it go before it consumes you. Her hands trembled as she read the words. It was no longer a harmless prank. The notes were deliberate, pointed, and personal. Someone was watching her. Someone who knew her fears, her insecurities. She locked the classroom door behind her and hurried to her car, her mind racing. As she drove home, the streetlights blurred into streaks of yellow and white, her grip on the steering wheel tight enough to make her knuckles ache. At home, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the darkened living room. The notes, Marcus's words, Principal Taylor's cryptic behavior, it all swirled in her mind like a storm. She retrieved the crumpled notes from her bag and spread them on the coffee table, their words glaring up at her like accusations. Evelyn's thoughts turned darker. What if this wasn't just Marcus? What if it was bigger than a student with a grudge? She thought of her years of teaching, the countless students she had disciplined, the times she had enforced order with an iron will. How many of them had left with resentment simmering beneath the surface? As the night stretched on, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully controlled world was slipping through her fingers. The fault lines were there, hidden beneath years of routine and authority. But now they were widening, threatening to crack open entirely. And Evelyn Harper wasn't sure she could stop it. Secrets beneath the surface. Evelyn Harper arrived at Lincoln High the next morning, her nerves frayed and her mind clouded by restless sleep. The 2 cryptic notes lay crumpled in her bag, their haunting messages replaying in her thoughts like a broken record. She clutched her coffee thermos tightly, as if the warmth might calm her trembling hands. Today, she told herself, she would confront Marcus. Whether or not he was behind the notes, his behavior was a part of the problem, and she needed answers. As she walked toward her classroom, her heels clicking sharply against the polished linoleum, she noticed something unusual. Students whispered in hushed tones, casting furtive glances her way. A group near the lockers fell silent as she passed, their faces tense with poorly concealed excitement. She ignored them, chalking it up to the usual teenage gossip. They'll find a new drama soon enough, she thought. But as she neared her classroom, her steps faltered. On the door, someone had taped a printed photograph. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she tore it down and examined it. The image was of her. She stood at the whiteboard, mid-lesson, her face captured in a moment of frustration. It was taken from outside the classroom window, the angle voyeuristic and invasive. Beneath the photo, in bold typeface, was a single sentence. "Control is slipping, Evelyn. What will you do when it's gone?" The room seemed to spin for a moment as Evelyn clutched the paper. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Someone was watching her, not just leaving notes but actively documenting her. The students whispering in the hallway weren't just gossiping, they knew. Her first period class began under a tense atmosphere. Evelyn's usual sharp demeanor was frayed, her movements stiff as she handed out worksheets and explained the day's assignment. The students seemed restless, stealing glances at one another, whispering more than usual. And then there was Marcus. He sat in his usual seat at the back, his notebook open, his pen moving lazily across the page. For once, he wasn't doodling. Instead, he seemed to be taking notes, or pretending to. His calm demeanor grated on Evelyn, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "Marcus," she said suddenly, interrupting the low hum of the classroom, "can I see you after class?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Marcus glanced up, his expression unreadable, and nodded. "Sure, Miss Harper." Satisfied, Evelyn returned to her desk, but her focus remained on Marcus. "He knows something. I'm sure of it." When the bell rang, the students filed out quickly, eager to escape the tension that had hung over the room. Marcus stayed behind, his movements unhurried as he packed his notebook into his bag. He approached Evelyn's desk, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his tone polite, but with an edge that set her teeth on edge. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice sharp. "Sit down." Marcus raised an eyebrow but complied, settling into the chair opposite her desk. Evelyn leaned forward, her fingers interlaced on the desk's surface. "I'm going to ask you directly. Are you behind this?" "Behind what?" Marcus asked, tilting his head slightly. His calm tone only stoked her frustration. "The notes, the photo," Evelyn snapped, pulling the crumpled notes from her bag and slapping them onto the desk. "Don't play dumb. I'm not in the mood for games." Marcus picked up one of the notes, his eyes scanning the words. He set it down carefully, then looked back at her. "No," he said simply. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. "You expect me to believe that?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Look, Miss Harper, I get it. You think I'm some troublemaker out to get you. But these? Not me. I don't need to write notes to tell you how I feel. I'm direct. You know that." His words stung with their truth. Evelyn hated to admit it, but Marcus wasn't the type to hide behind anonymous messages. If he wanted to confront her, he would do it openly, as he had in the past. "Then who?" she demanded, her voice trembling with frustration. "If it's not you, who's doing this?" Marcus shrugged. "Could be anyone. Miss Harper, you've made a lot of people angry over the years." The statement landed like a blow. Evelyn sat back, the weight of his words sinking in. She had prided herself on her authority, her ability to enforce discipline, but now she wondered. Had she crossed lines she didn't even see? Had her pursuit of control left a trail of resentment in its wake? Marcus stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "If you really want answers, maybe you should start looking in the mirror," he said quietly. "Or better yet, talk to Principal Taylor. I'm sure he knows more than he lets on." Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. Before she could respond, Marcus walked out, leaving her alone with the crumpled notes and a growing sense of dread. Evelyn couldn't focus for the rest of the day. Marcus's parting words gnawed at her. She avoided the staff lounge, unwilling to face the judgmental glances of her colleagues, and retreated to her classroom during lunch. As she sat at her desk, her thoughts churned. Marcus had mentioned Principal Taylor. The man was enigmatic, rarely showing his hand, but he had seemed unusually attentive to her in recent weeks. She thought back to their conversation in the hallway. "Respect goes both ways," he had said. Was it a warning? A veiled acknowledgement of something more? The final bell rang, releasing students into the warm afternoon sun. Evelyn stayed behind, her classroom empty and silent. Finally, she made a decision. If Principal Taylor knew something, she would find out. Principal Taylor's office was tucked away at the end of the main hallway, its polished door gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Evelyn hesitated outside, her heart pounding. Summoning her courage, she knocked firmly. "Come in," his deep voice called. She entered to find Principal Taylor seated behind his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up, his expression neutral but attentive. "Miss Harper," he said, gesturing to a chair. "What can I do for you?" Evelyn sat, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I need to talk to you about something unusual," she began, choosing her words carefully. Taylor's brow furrowed slightly. "Go on." She pulled the photograph from her bag and placed it on his desk. "This was taped to my classroom door this morning. And it's not the first incident." Taylor picked up the photograph, his expression darkening as he studied it. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "No," Evelyn admitted. "I thought it was best to come straight to you." He set the photograph down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "Miss Harper, I won't mince words. This is serious. If someone is targeting you, we need to address it immediately." Evelyn nodded, but something about his tone made her uneasy. "Do you have any idea who might be behind it?" she asked. Taylor hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I have my suspicions," he said carefully, "but I'll need time to look into it." His vagueness frustrated her, but before she could press further, Taylor leaned forward, his tone growing stern. "In the meantime, I suggest you focus on maintaining control in your classroom. Whoever is doing this wants to rattle you. Don't give them the satisfaction." Evelyn left his office feeling more unsettled than before. Taylor's response had been professional, even supportive, but there was something beneath the surface, something he wasn't telling her. That night, Evelyn sat in her dimly lit living room, staring at the photograph. Principal Taylor's reaction had been too measured, too controlled. Did he know more than he was letting on? And why had Marcus pointed her toward him? As the clock ticked toward midnight, Evelyn felt the weight of her secrets pressing down on her. She had spent years building her authority, enforcing discipline with an iron will. But now, the cracks in her foundation were widening, and she could feel the fault lines shifting beneath her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it all together. The cracks deepened. The next morning, Evelyn Harper walked into Lincoln High feeling like a ship bracing against an inevitable storm. Her usual confidence had eroded into a gnawing unease. The cryptic notes, the invasive photograph, and Principal Taylor's measured response weighed heavily on her mind. As she approached her classroom, the murmur of students in the hall sounded sharper, more pointed. She could feel their eyes on her, their whispers pressing against her already frayed nerves. When she reached her door, she stopped in her tracks. Another photograph was taped to it. This time, it was a picture of her standing in the teacher's lounge, staring out the window, her posture tense. Beneath it was a chilling message. The image of control isn't the same as having it. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just someone trying to scare her. It felt like whoever was behind this wanted to dismantle her entirely. She yanked the photo off the door, crumpled it in her hand, and stormed into her classroom. The students who were lingering nearby quickly scattered, their laughter and whispers echoing faintly down the hallway. Inside, Evelyn sat at her desk, staring at the crumpled photograph in her fist. The words burned in her mind, a reminder that whoever was doing this had access to her private moments. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the photo out on her desk. The thought of being watched, of being scrutinized, made her skin crawl. For years, she had maintained an image of unshakable authority, but now that image was cracking, and she could feel the pieces slipping through her fingers. The morning classes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Marcus was unusually quiet during first period, scribbling in his notebook without his usual smirks or remarks. Evelyn couldn't tell if he was intentionally keeping a low profile or simply biding his time. Either way, his presence felt like a loaded gun, and she couldn't ignore it. By lunch, her nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. She retreated to her classroom instead of the teacher's lounge, unable to face her colleagues' sidelong glances and whispers. As she sat at her desk, trying to calm the thrum of anxiety in her chest, her email pinged. Evelyn frowned and opened her laptop. The subject line of the email made her blood run cold. "You can't outrun the past forever." Her fingers hovered over the mousepad, her breath shallow. Finally, she clicked it open. The email contained no text, just an attachment. Evelyn hesitated, every instinct screaming at her not to open it. But curiosity and dread overruled caution. She clicked on the file. The screen filled with scanned pages of a disciplinary report. Her disciplinary report, from 10 years ago, at her previous school. It detailed an incident where Evelyn had physically grabbed a student's arm during a heated argument, leaving visible bruises. The report had been buried at the time, thanks to the school board's desire to avoid scandal, but now it was staring back at her in black and white. Her chest tightened as she read the damning words. This was the skeleton she had worked so hard to keep buried. She had convinced herself that it was a one-time mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. But seeing it laid bare like this, her shame returned with a vengeance. The email had no sender listed, no signature, just the attached report. Evelyn's mind raced. Who could have access to this? The school where it happened had wiped it from her record, and she had left shortly afterward to start fresh at Lincoln High. She had taken every precaution to ensure it never followed her. That evening, Evelyn sat in her darkened living room, the glow of her laptop the only light in the room. The disciplinary report was still on the screen, a constant reminder of her failure. She poured herself another glass of wine, her third of the night, and stared at the screen as if it might offer answers. Her thoughts turned to Principal Taylor. He had been at Lincoln High for years, his reputation spotless, his leadership respected. But Marcus's comment about him had planted a seed of doubt. "Talk to Principal Taylor," Marcus had said. And Taylor's reaction to the photograph yesterday had been too controlled, too careful. Evelyn opened a browser and began searching for anything that might connect Taylor to her past. She scored old faculty directories, news articles, and social media posts. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, she found something that made her freeze. A decade ago, Taylor had been on the school board at her previous school, the same school where the disciplinary report had been filed. He hadn't been a principal then, but he had been in a position of authority. And his name appeared in an article about innovative strategies to protect schools' reputations during crisis. Evelyn's stomach turned. Had Taylor been involved in covering up her incident? Was he the one behind the notes and the photos now, trying to leverage her past against her? The next day, Evelyn decided to confront Taylor. She couldn't let this game continue. The air in the school felt heavier than usual, the whispers louder, the stares sharper. As she walked toward his office, her resolve wavered, but she forced herself to keep moving. She knocked on the door firmly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Come in," Taylor's deep voice called. Evelyn entered, clutching the crumpled photograph and the printout of the email in her hand. Taylor looked up from his desk, his expression calm as always. "Miss Harper," he said, setting down his pen. "What brings you here?" Evelyn stepped forward and placed the photograph and the email printout on his desk. "This," she said, her voice sharp. "I want to know if you had anything to do with this." Taylor's brow furrowed as he picked up the photograph and examined it. "I assure you, Miss Harper, I have no idea what this is about," he said evenly. "Don't lie to me," Evelyn snapped, her composure cracking. "I know you were on the board at my previous school. You knew about the incident. You helped bury it." Taylor's expression darkened, but he didn't deny it. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "And it was handled. Why are you bringing this up now?" "Because someone is using it against me," Evelyn said, her voice rising. "And if it's not you, then who? Who has access to this kind of information?" Taylor leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I don't appreciate the accusation, Miss Harper, but if someone is targeting you, we need to address it together." Evelyn stared at him, trying to read his expression. Was he genuinely concerned, or was this just another layer of the game? Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," Taylor called. The door opened, and Marcus stepped inside. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something Evelyn hadn't seen before: urgency. "You need to see this," Marcus said, holding up his phone. Taylor gestured for him to approach. Marcus handed over the phone, and Evelyn leaned in to look. On the screen was a video, clearly recorded in secret. It showed a meeting in a dimly lit office, Taylor's office. In the video, Taylor was speaking with another staff member, discussing how to manage sensitive situations involving faculty misconduct. Evelyn's name came up, along with details about her past incident. Evelyn's heart dropped. The room felt like it was spinning. Taylor's calm facade cracked for the first time, his expression darkening as he watched the video. "Where did you get this?" Taylor demanded, his voice sharp. Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "It's all over social media. Everyone's talking about it." Evelyn stared at Taylor, her mind reeling. This wasn't just about her anymore. The cracks in the foundation of Lincoln High were spreading, and the truth was starting to spill out. For the first time, Evelyn felt the weight of her own complicity. The control she had clung to for so long had blinded her to the larger system of silence and cover-ups she was part of. And now it was all unraveling. The system exposed. The moment Marcus handed over the phone with the video, Evelyn Harper's world seemed to tilt off its axis. Principal Taylor sat back in his chair, his face darkened by a shadow of anger and fear. Evelyn stared at the phone screen, replaying the video in her mind. The audio was clear, the words unmistakable. "We'll handle it quietly," Taylor's voice said in the video. "Harper's incident doesn't need to become a public scandal. If we control the narrative, it will pass, just like the others." Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You care to explain that, Principal Taylor?" Taylor's eyes flickered between Evelyn and Marcus, his jaw tightening. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured but strained. "This video is out of context," he began, his tone attempting to assert control. "It was recorded during a confidential meeting. Whoever leaked it violated the trust of this institution." Marcus scoffed. "Violating trust? You mean like covering up misconduct to protect your reputation?" "Enough," Taylor snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. His calm facade shattered, revealing the cracks beneath. "This isn't the time or place to have this discussion." Evelyn's voice cut through the tension. "Then when, Principal? Because this is bigger than just me. That video isn't just about my past. It's about the entire system you've built here." Taylor's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Miss Harper. You're not exactly innocent in all of this." The accusation hit Evelyn like a slap, but she refused to back down. "I'm aware of my mistakes," she said, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every student and teacher you've failed by prioritizing silence over accountability." Marcus nodded in agreement, stepping closer to the desk. "You want to talk about trust? Let's talk about how many people you've silenced. How many students have suffered because of your need to protect the school's image." Taylor leaned back, his expression hardening. "You don't understand the complexities of running a school, Marcus. Sometimes compromises have to be made." "Compromises?" Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "Like letting abusive teachers keep their jobs. Like turning students into scapegoats to avoid dealing with the real issues. You don't get to call that leadership." Evelyn watched the exchange, her emotions roiling. Marcus's words struck a chord. For years, she had justified her own actions as part of maintaining order. Now, she realized how deeply she had bought into the same flawed system Taylor had perpetuated. The ripple effect. By lunchtime, the video had spread like wildfire. Students shared it in group chats, and parents forwarded it to one another. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #LincolnHighExposed and #AccountabilityNow. Outside the school, a small group of parents had already begun gathering, holding signs demanding answers. The faculty lounge was unusually quiet. Teachers huddled in small groups, their conversations hushed. Some avoided Evelyn entirely, while others cast her sympathetic glances. She sat alone at the far end of the room, her coffee untouched, her mind racing. "Miss Harper." A voice interrupted her thoughts. Evelyn looked up to see Mrs. Rodriguez, a history teacher with whom she had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship. Mrs. Rodriguez sat down across from her, her expression conflicted. "I saw the video," she began hesitantly. "Is it true? Did Taylor really?" Evelyn sighed. "It's true," she admitted. "And it's not just about me. Taylor's been covering up incidents for years." Mrs. Rodriguez's face darkened. "I had a student last year, Alyssa. She came to me, saying another teacher was making inappropriate comments. I told Taylor about it, and he said he'd handle it. But the teacher stayed, and Alyssa transferred schools. I thought it was odd, but I didn't press." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "I've ignored things I shouldn't have. I told myself it wasn't my place to question him." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "What happens now?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "But this can't stay hidden anymore." Confrontation in the courtyard. By the end of the day, the tension in the air was electric. Students gathered in the courtyard, their voices rising in chants. Marcus stood at the center, holding a sign that read, "Students deserve truth." He wasn't alone. Dozens of students had joined him, their homemade posters demanding transparency and justice. Evelyn watched from the steps of the main building, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected the students to rally so quickly, but their determination was palpable. She spotted Malik and Chris among the crowd, their faces resolute as they led chants alongside Marcus. "Miss Harper," a voice called from behind her. Evelyn turned to see Principal Taylor approaching, his face a mask of barely controlled frustration. "What are you doing out here?" "Watching," Evelyn replied, her tone cool. "Maybe you should too." "They're not just protesting me, Taylor. They're protesting you." Taylor's lips tightened. "We need to get this under control before it spirals further." "And how do you plan to do that?" Evelyn asked, crossing her arms. "Another cover-up. Another vague promise to handle it." Taylor's glare intensified. "You're dangerously close to insubordination, Harper." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about them." She gestured toward the students. "You can't silence them like you've silenced everyone else." A student's voice. At the center of the crowd, Marcus took the makeshift stage, a stack of cafeteria trays stacked near the fountain. He held up a hand, and the chanting quieted. "This school has failed us," he began, his voice strong and clear. "Not just today, but for years. They've failed to protect us. They've let teachers who don't care about us stay. They've punished the wrong people, and we're done staying quiet." Cheers erupted from the crowd. "Miss Harper," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You're not perfect, but at least you're here. At least you're facing this with us." Can the same be said for Principal Taylor? All eyes turned to the main building where Taylor stood, his face pale. Evelyn felt the weight of the moment. Marcus was right. She wasn't perfect, but she had a chance to do the right thing now. The turning point. Taylor stormed back into the building, but Evelyn stayed, stepping forward to address the students. "I've made mistakes," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "I've been part of a system that hurt you, and for that, I'm sorry. But you're right to demand better. And I'll stand with you to make sure you get it." The students erupted into applause, their voices rising in support. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. The cracks in the system were widening, but perhaps they could finally let the light in. As she stepped down from the makeshift stage, Marcus met her gaze. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the uneasy alliance they had formed. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Evelyn felt ready to fight. The fight for truth. The next day dawned gray and heavy, a fitting backdrop for the storm brewing at Lincoln High. Overnight, the video's reach had expanded beyond the school. Local news stations had picked up the story, and hashtags like #JusticeForStudents and #ExposeTheSystem trended on social media. Parents, alumni, and concerned citizens joined the conversation, demanding accountability. Evelyn Harper stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection. Her face looked drawn, the faint lines around her mouth and eyes more pronounced after days of sleepless nights. This morning, however, she felt something new: resolve. The fear, the guilt, the anger, they were all still there, but they were overshadowed by the determination to finally take responsibility for her role in the broken system. The emergency meeting. Principal Taylor had called an emergency meeting for all staff before the first bell. The teachers filed into the auditorium, their faces a mix of confusion, apprehension, and quiet anger. Whispers filled the room as they speculated about what Taylor might say. Evelyn took a seat near the back, her posture stiff, her eyes scanning the room. She noticed Mrs. Rodriguez sitting with Mr. Daniels and Ms. Green, all of them avoiding eye contact with Taylor as he took the stage. Taylor's usual air of authority seemed diminished, his shoulders slightly hunched as he approached the podium. "Good morning," he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I know many of you are aware of the situation unfolding at our school. Allegations have been made, some of them directed at me, others at our policies. Let me assure you that we are working to address these concerns." The murmurs grew louder. A teacher near the front, Mr. Rodriguez, raised his hand but didn't wait for acknowledgement. "With all due respect, Principal Taylor, what exactly are you doing to address it? Because right now, it looks like the students and parents are the ones leading this charge." Taylor's jaw tightened. "This is a complicated matter, Mr. Rodriguez. Decisions take time." "We don't have time," Evelyn interrupted, standing. Her voice carried over the room, silencing the murmurs. "Every day we wait, the trust we've lost erodes further. We've ignored problems for too long, and now they've exploded in our faces." Taylor's eyes narrowed as he stared at her. "Miss Harper, I understand your frustration, but this is not the place." "This is exactly the place," Evelyn shot back, stepping forward. "We're the ones responsible. We're the ones who failed these students, and we're the ones who need to fix it." The room fell silent, every eye now on Evelyn. Her heart pounded, but she pressed on. The video was just the tipping point. "It's not just about me or you, Principal Taylor. It's about a culture of silence, of prioritizing reputation over people. We've been complicit, all of us. And it's time we stop." Taylor's face darkened, but before he could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez stood up. "She's right. I've been here for years, and I've seen things I should have spoken up about. I told myself it wasn't my business, or that it wouldn't make a difference. But it does." One by one, other teachers began standing, voicing their agreement. Evelyn felt a swell of emotion as she realized she wasn't alone in this fight. The school board meeting. By midday, the tension had reached a boiling point. The school board had called an emergency public meeting, held in the gymnasium to accommodate the growing crowd of parents, students, teachers, and media. The atmosphere was electric, the air filled with the buzz of whispered conversations, and the occasional chant from the students gathered outside. Evelyn sat in the audience, flanked by Marcus and his friends, Malik and Chris. The boys had become unlikely allies in her fight for truth, their determination and courage inspiring her to keep pushing forward. Principal Taylor sat at the front, his expression grim as the board members shuffled papers and prepared to begin. The board president, a stern woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, opened the meeting. "We are here to address the allegations brought forward against the administration of Lincoln High School. We will hear from Principal Taylor, faculty, students, and parents. Our goal is to uncover the truth and determine the necessary steps forward." Taylor was the first to speak. He outlined his tenure at the school, emphasizing his accomplishments and the challenges of leading such a large and diverse institution. But his tone was defensive, his words carefully crafted to deflect blame. When he finished, the board president turned to the audience. "We will now hear from others who wish to speak." Marcus stood first, his movements deliberate as he approached the microphone. The room quieted as he adjusted the height and looked out at the crowd. "My name is Marcus Taylor," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I'm a student here at Lincoln High. For years, I've seen my friends punished unfairly, their voices silenced. We were told to respect the system, but the system never respected us." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm here to say that we won't stay quiet anymore. We deserve better. We deserve teachers who care about us, policies that protect us, and leaders who take responsibility." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus stepped down, his expression calm but resolute. Evelyn stood next. Her hands trembled as she approached the microphone, but she forced herself to speak. "My name is Evelyn Harper. I've been a teacher here for over a decade, and I've made mistakes." She glanced at Marcus, then back at the board. "I was part of the problem. I enforced rules without questioning them, silenced students when they needed to be heard, and ignored things I shouldn't have. I justified it as maintaining order, but I see now that I was wrong." She took a deep breath. "But I'm here today because I want to make it right. We need to dismantle this toxic system and build something better." not just for the students, but for the future of this school. The applause was thunderous, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. The fallout. The meeting stretched late into the night, but by the end, the board made a series of monumental decisions. Principal Taylor was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. A task force, including students, parents, and teachers, was established to review the school's policies and recommend reforms. Evelyn, though not officially disciplined, volunteered to step back from her leadership roles to focus on rebuilding trust with her students. Outside, the students celebrated, their voices rising in chants of victory. Evelyn stood on the sidelines, watching as Marcus and his friends high-fived and laughed. For the first time, the school felt alive with the promise of change. The road ahead. In the weeks that followed, Lincoln High became a symbol of accountability and reform. The media attention shifted from scandal to progress as the school began implementing new policies. Restorative justice programs replaced outdated disciplinary measures, and student voices were given a seat at the table. Evelyn worked closely with Marcus and other students, facilitating open discussions about respect, power, and trust. The process wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, and not everyone was on board with the changes. But the momentum was undeniable. One afternoon, as Evelyn packed up her classroom, Marcus stopped by. "Miss Harper," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "you did good today." Evelyn smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "So did you, Marcus." He nodded, then turned to leave but paused. "You know, respect really does go both ways." Evelyn laughed softly. "I'm starting to figure that out." As Marcus walked away, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The cracks in her foundation were still there, but now they were filled with something stronger. The will to change, the courage to face the truth, and the hope for a better future. A new legacy. 3 months had passed since the explosive revelations rocked Lincoln High School. The leaves had begun to turn golden, carpeting the school grounds in shades of amber and rust. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of renewal, but inside the walls of Lincoln High, the echoes of the past still lingered. Evelyn Harper walked into her classroom early that morning, her hands full of papers and books. Her desk was a controlled mess of lesson plans, notebooks, and new materials on restorative justice. The classroom itself felt different now. Gone were the rigid rows of desks. Instead, students sat in clusters, encouraging collaboration and conversation. On one wall, a student-designed poster read, "In this classroom, every voice matters." Evelyn placed her things on the desk and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. Things weren't perfect, not yet, but they were better. The Student-Teacher Forum. That afternoon, the school hosted its first Student-Teacher Accountability Forum, an initiative born out of the task force created after the scandal. Students, faculty, and parents gathered in the gymnasium, which had been transformed into a space for open dialogue. Round tables replaced rows of chairs, and microphones were placed in the center of each table to encourage participation. Evelyn took her seat at one of the tables, alongside Marcus, Malik, Chris, and a few other students. Across from her sat Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Daniels, and a parent who had been vocal during the earlier protests. The air buzzed with a mixture of tension and excitement. Principal Taylor, though no longer in his position, was present as an observer. He sat in the back, his once commanding presence subdued. The new interim principal, Mrs. Patel, stepped up to the microphone to open the forum. "Today is about listening," she began, her voice warm but firm. "It's about acknowledging what's gone wrong and figuring out how we move forward, together." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt as she glanced at Marcus. She thought back to the time she had dismissed his questions or ignored his quiet defiance. But Marcus had never backed down. He had been the catalyst for this change, and she silently vowed to keep earning the trust she had lost. Marcus leaned forward and tapped the microphone at their table. "I'll go first," he said, his voice steady. All eyes turned to him as he began. For years, students like me felt invisible. We were told to follow the rules, respect authority, and stay in line. But what happens when the authority doesn't respect us back? His words hung in the air, met with nods from students around the room. I don't want this to just be about blame, Marcus continued. We've had enough of that. What I want is real change. Policies that protect us. Teachers who see us as people, not just problems to be managed. Evelyn's chest tightened, but she felt a sense of pride too. Marcus wasn't just calling out the system. He was offering a vision for something better. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke next. As teachers, we sometimes get so focused on maintaining control that we forget what really matters. Connecting with our students. I'm sorry for the times I didn't listen, for the times I let fear or convenience guide my actions. I'm here to do better. The conversation flowed from table to table. Students shared stories of feeling dismissed or unfairly punished. Teachers admitted their own struggles with burnout, bias, and the pressures of the system. For the first time, it felt like everyone was truly listening. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment before leaning into the microphone. I've been teaching for over 20 years, she began, and for most of that time, I believe that control was the key to success. But control isn't the same as respect, and respect is something I didn't always give. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on. To those I've hurt, students, colleagues, I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I can change how I move forward, and I'm committed to doing just that. The room was silent for a beat before soft applause broke out, growing louder as others joined in. Evelyn felt a weight lift, though she knew the real work was just beginning. The new policies. The task force had made significant progress. New policies were being implemented across the school, including restorative justice circles. Instead of automatic detentions or suspensions, students and teachers now participated in mediated conversations to address conflicts and find solutions. Bias awareness training. Faculty and staff were required to attend workshops on recognizing and addressing their own biases. Student Advocacy Board. A group of students, including Marcus and his friends, was created to provide direct input on school policies and hold the administration accountable. Transparency measures. Incident reports could no longer be swept under the rug. Clear procedures for addressing complaints were established, with oversight from an independent committee. Evelyn threw herself into these initiatives. She volunteered to lead restorative circles and facilitated bias workshops for her colleagues. Each step felt like a small act of redemption, a visit from the past. One quiet afternoon, Evelyn sat grading essays when there was a knock at her classroom door. She looked up to see Principal Taylor standing there, his hands in his pockets. "May I come in?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, unsure of what to expect. Taylor stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to say, thank you," he began, his voice hesitant, "for speaking up, for pushing back." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "I wasn't alone, and it wasn't easy." Taylor sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "No, it wasn't. But you were right. I let fear guide too many of my decisions. I thought I was protecting the school, but I was really protecting myself." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm stepping away from education," he said quietly. "It's time for me to reflect, to figure out how I went so wrong." Evelyn studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's never too late to change, Taylor. But it starts with owning what you've done." He nodded. "I'm trying, and I hope you'll keep doing what you're doing. The school needs people like you." As he left, Evelyn felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope for him. A new chapter. By winter, Lincoln High felt like a different place. The tension that had once hung over the school had eased, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Students were more engaged, teachers more collaborative. The changes weren't perfect, but they were a start. One morning, Evelyn walked into her classroom to find Marcus waiting for her, a stack of papers in his hands. "What's this?" she asked, taking the papers. It's a proposal, Marcus said, grinning. The Student Advocacy Board wants to start a peer mentoring program. I figured you'd know who to talk to about getting it approved. Evelyn scanned the proposal, a smile spreading across her face. This is good, Marcus. Really good. He shrugged, but his pride was evident. Thanks. And thanks for listening. Evelyn looked up, meeting his gaze. Always. As Marcus left to join his friends, Evelyn felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a part of something bigger, something that mattered. The bell rang, and students began filing in, their voices filling the room with energy and possibility. Evelyn stood at the front of the classroom, ready to begin a new lesson, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. A foundation rebuilt. The first snow of the season fell on Lincoln High, blanketing the school in a serene white. The stark contrast between the peaceful exterior and the intensity of the past months wasn't lost on Evelyn Harper as she parked her car and stared at the building. For years, the school had symbolized control, order, and discipline to her. Now, it felt like something else, possibility. Inside, the halls buzzed with life as students bundled in coats laughed and chatted. Posters for the new peer mentorship program and the upcoming Unity Week lined the walls, their bright colors a reminder of the changes that had swept through the school. Evelyn adjusted the scarf around her neck and made her way to the auditorium for a special assembly. The Student Advocacy Board, spearheaded by Marcus and supported by a coalition of students and teachers, had organized a public presentation on the school's progress and future plans. It was their way of holding everyone accountable, a promise made during the tumultuous weeks of reform. The presentation. The auditorium was packed, with students, parents, faculty, and even district officials in attendance. Marcus stood at the podium, his usual calm demeanor now radiating a quiet confidence. His speech was polished but heartfelt, a mix of statistics, personal anecdotes, and plans for the future. As a school, Marcus began, his voice steady, we've faced hard truths about how we've failed to protect and respect one another, but the important thing is that we're working to change, real change. He gestured to a large screen behind him, where images and videos from the past months played. Students participating in restorative justice circles, teachers attending workshops, and moments from the first community forum. Unity Week isn't just an event, Marcus continued. It's a reminder of what we can accomplish when we listen to each other, when we respect each other. The audience broke into applause as Marcus stepped back, yielding the stage to other members of the advocacy board, each sharing their experiences and goals. Evelyn sat in the front row, feeling a swell of pride. This was the school she had always wanted to be a part of, even if it had taken far too long to get there. A personal turning point. After the assembly, Evelyn lingered in the auditorium as students and parents filed out. She watched Marcus speak with a group of parents, his composure striking for someone so young. As he turned and spotted her, he excused himself and walked over. "Miss Harper," he said, smiling faintly, "what did you think?" "I think you're going to be running the world someday," she replied, her smile genuine. "You were incredible up there." Marcus shrugged, but his pride was evident. "I just said what needed to be said." "That's leadership," Evelyn said softly. "It's more than just being in charge. It's about knowing when to listen and when to speak. You've got that balance." Marcus tilted his head, studying her. "You know, I used to think you hated me." Evelyn's smile faltered. "I never hated you, Marcus. I was intimidated by you. You challenged me in ways I wasn't ready for. And for that, I owe you an apology." "You've already apologized," he said, "and you're making it right. That's what matters." They stood in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. "You've got a lot of people watching you now," Marcus added, his tone serious. "The students, the other teachers, don't let them down." "I won't," Evelyn promised. Unity Week. The following Monday marked the beginning of Unity Week, a series of student-led workshops, events, and discussions aimed at fostering understanding and collaboration. The week kicked off with a town hall-style meeting in the cafeteria, where students shared personal stories about their experiences at Lincoln High. Evelyn sat in the audience, listening as Malik, one of Marcus's closest friends, stood up to speak. "I used to think school was just a place you had to survive," Malik said, his voice shaking slightly. "You keep your head down, don't ask questions, and just get through it. But now, it feels different. Like maybe we can actually thrive here." His words resonated deeply, and Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought back to her early years of teaching, when she had believed that discipline was the only path to success. How many students had felt like Malik, unseen, unheard, because of her approach? The circle of truth. One of the most powerful moments of Unity Week came during a restorative justice circle held in the library. It was an invitation-only event, designed for students and teachers who had directly clashed in the past. Evelyn was invited, along with Marcus and a few other students she had taught over the years. The circle was facilitated by an outside mediator, a calm and empathetic woman named Dr. Elena Ward. She began by explaining the rules: honesty, respect, and a commitment to listen without interrupting. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she hesitated. The faces of the students around her were a reminder of the times she had failed them. But she took a deep breath and began. "I've spent most of my career believing that authority meant control," she said, "that if I could just maintain order, everything else would fall into place. But I see now that I was wrong. I let my fear of losing control cloud my judgment. I didn't listen when I should have, and I hurt people because of it." She looked directly at Marcus. "I hurt you, and I'm sorry." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "I know you are," he said quietly, "and I forgive you. But it's not just about me. It's about making sure no one else feels the way I did." The circle continued, each participant sharing their stories and emotions. By the end, there was a sense of catharsis, a release of years of tension and resentment. Evelyn left the library feeling lighter, but also more determined than ever to uphold the promises she had made. A teacher transformed. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn became a mentor for younger teachers, sharing her journey and encouraging them to embrace the new approach to discipline and engagement. She partnered with Mrs. Rodriguez and other faculty members to design new curricula that emphasized empathy, critical thinking, and collaboration. Her classroom became a safe space for students to express themselves. She encouraged debates, creative projects, and discussions about real-world issues. The rigid authority she had once wielded was replaced with mutual respect, and the change in her students was palpable. One afternoon, as she was grading papers, a student approached her desk. It was Alyssa, the girl Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned during the emergency meeting. "Miss Harper," Alyssa said hesitantly. "Yes, Alyssa. I just wanted to say thank you," Alyssa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. It's different now. Better." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling. "Thank you for saying that, Alyssa. It means more than you know." The legacy continues. Spring arrived, and with it, a sense of renewal. The changes at Lincoln High had taken root, and while there were still challenges, the school had become a place of growth and possibility. On the last day of the school year, Evelyn sat in her empty classroom, reflecting on the journey she had taken. She thought about Marcus, the student who had pushed her to confront her flaws. She thought about Principal Taylor, whose fall had forced her to rise. And she thought about the students yet to come, the ones who would inherit this new Lincoln High. As the final bell rang, Evelyn stood and walked to the window. Outside, students laughed and hugged, their voices carrying on the breeze. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, not because she had regained control, but because she had learned to let it go. Epilogue. A letter. Months later, Evelyn received a letter in the mail. It was from Marcus, who had graduated and gone on to college. Dear Miss Harper, I just wanted to thank you, not just for listening, but for fighting. You showed me that change is possible, even when it's hard. I hope you know how much that means to me, and to all of us. P.S. Respect does go both ways. Thanks for teaching me that. Evelyn smiled as she folded the letter. Marcus was right. Respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned. And Lincoln High was earning it, one day at a time.